She had spent years building a life of quiet order, early mornings, perfect reports, a steady smile that never cracked. But that morning, something inside her finally did. When Claire Whitman calm, dependable, invisible-faced Evan Mercer, the arrogant millionaire CEO who seemed untouchable, she reached her breaking point, a single mistake, a single insult, and before she could stop herself, the coffee in her hand was no longer in her hand. It was the moment everything changed, because sometimes it takes one act of defiance to remind us of who we are and what we deserve. But what she didn't know, what no one in that glass tower could have guessed, was that this act of rebellion would open a door neither of them expected. A story of pride and vulnerability, of fear, truth, and second chances, of two people learning that real strength isn't about control, it's about honesty. Stay with this story, because what began as anger will become the awakening of two human hearts. The morning sun rose over downtown Seattle, spilling a pale gold light across the mirrored face of Brightline Innovations. From the street below, the tower shimmered all glass, and ambition a monument to the speed of modern life. Inside, the air hummed with the quiet rhythm of elevators, the soft click of heels, the muted voices of the young and tireless. Claire Whitman moved through it all with a kind of practiced grace. 46 years old, executive coordinator, calm, reliable. A woman whose steadiness had once been her pride, and now felt, at times, like her disguise. She carried a tray with 2 coffees, one black, one oat milk with a dash of cinnamon the way he liked it. The elevator doors closed, mirrors reflecting her neat gray blazer, the faint tiredness under her eyes, the small silver cross at her neck that had belonged to her mother. 30 floors up. She took a quiet breath as the numbers blinked past 14, 22, 29, 30. The doors opened into a space of light and chrome. The executive floor was silent, spotless, almost sacred. The scent of roasted beans drifted through the cool air. At the far end, through a glass wall, she could see him, Evan Mercer, the CEO, standing with his back to her, sleeves rolled up, voice low as he discussed something with his assistant. Evan Mercer, 41, brilliant, precise, unforgiving. A man whose name carried both admiration and unease. Claire had worked for him for 6 years, long enough to know his moods. The small tension in his jaw when a deadline slipped, the rare flicker of warmth that vanished almost as soon as it appeared. She placed the coffee on the corner of his desk. He didn't look up right away. Just said, "Is this the updated financial summary?" "Yes," she replied softly, handing over the folder. He opened it, scanned the pages with that same surgical focus. A brief pause. Then, without looking at her, "There's a rounding error in line 34. Her heart sank. She knew instantly what he meant. It was a decimal point, barely off nothing that changed the outcome. Still, in his world, precision was everything. "I'll correct it right away," she said, voice steady, hoping he'd let it pass. But he didn't. He turned, his expression cool as frost. "Claire," he said, "I asked for exact, not almost." The room went still. The assistant froze. For a moment, all she could hear was the hum of the air conditioning, the faint buzz of fluorescent light. She wanted to shrink, to disappear behind the neat lines of her clipboard. He placed the report on the table in front of his team. "This," he said, "is what happens when details are neglected." A soft murmur rippled through the room. Someone shifted uncomfortably. Claire stood there, cheeks warm, breath shallow, the weight of humiliation pressing against her ribs. Outside the window, the city glittered in indifferent light. Inside, time seemed to slow. It wasn't the first time he'd been sharp. She'd seen it before, the way his words could slice clean through someone's confidence. But this time, it felt different, because she wasn't just tired, she was empty. The long nights, the careful silence, the years spent proving her worth in a place that measured value by perfection. And suddenly, she felt every one of her 46 years in the ache behind her eyes. in the quiet longing for the small apartment that waited for her, where an old golden retriever named Milo would lift his head when she came home. She thought of the life she'd built, not glamorous, but steady. The morning walks with Milo, the evenings with tea and an old jazz record, the way she sometimes sat by the window, watching the city lights blur, wondering when her life had become so small. And now, here she was, standing in a room of glass, surrounded by people half her age, her dignity laid bare over a misplaced decimal. Evan moved on with the meeting, his tone smooth again, already forgetting the moment that had cracked something open inside her. But for Claire, it lingered like a quiet bruise under the skin. As she left the conference room, the hallway seemed colder, the walls gleamed, the city pulsed beyond the windows, and somewhere deep inside, a voice she'd ignored for years began to whisper, "How much longer can you keep living like this?" She didn't answer. She couldn't, not yet. But that question followed her all the way down the elevator, into the lobby, and out into the crisp Seattle air. The world was rushing by, ride shares pulling up, young faces glowing behind phone screens, laughter spilling from a nearby cafe. And Claire stood there for a moment, holding her paper cup, feeling like a ghost in her own story. Above her, the tower shimmered beautiful and distant, like a dream she no longer believed in. And for the first time in years, she let herself wonder if, maybe, something had to change. The elevator doors closed behind her with a soft hiss, and for a moment, Claire simply stood there holding her breath, as if the silence could wash away what had just happened upstairs. But humiliation doesn't fade that easily. It lingers sharp, metallic somewhere between the chest and the throat. That night, she tried to let it go. She walked Milo through the drizzle, let the cool air sting her cheeks, made tea she didn't drink. She told herself it was just another bad day, just another bruise she'd cover with professionalism. Yet, when morning came, the ache was still there, heavier now, like a stone she couldn't set down. By 8 Zurem, she was back in the building, same glass walls, same spotless hallways, and Evan Mercer already in motion, already commanding the room with that quiet, demanding certainty that made people both admire and fear him. Claire took her seat at the long conference table, surrounded by bright young faces, screens glowing, charts projected in crisp blue light. The meeting began, numbers, forecasts, pitches, all the usual rhythm of control. On the surface, she was calm, nodding, typing, keeping pace, but inside, her pulse was loud. Every word he said, every sideways glance, reminded her of the moment he'd humiliated her. And beneath that sting was something deeper, a simmering exhaustion, years in the making. When the meeting ended, applause scattered like raindrops. People rose, gathering laptops and cups, murmuring their polite goodbyes. Evan dismissed the team, his tone clipped. "Good work. Claire, stay a moment." Her heart tightened. She stood still as the room emptied, the sound of footsteps fading down the hall. He didn't look at her right away, just scanned through a folder, marking something with a silver pen. Then, without lifting his eyes, he said, "I hope yesterday's mistake was a wake-up call." The words landed softly, but carried weight. She swallowed. "I understand. I've already corrected it." He closed the folder, looked up. His gaze was cool, detached. "You've been here a long time. Claire, you should know better. Precision isn't optional. If you can't handle the pressure, maybe this isn't the right environment for you." Something in her chest shifted, a small, sharp crack. She wanted to say she was sorry, that she'd do better, that she just needed a moment of grace. But the apology caught in her throat, because what she really felt wasn't guilt. It was anger. Anger at being spoken to like a child. Anger at how easily he dismissed years of loyalty. Anger at herself for allowing it. Time and time again. She looked at him. Really looked at him, the man so many admired, standing behind his desk like a general, confident, untouched. But for the first time, she saw something beneath the control, a flicker of weariness, maybe even pain. Still, the words he'd spoken had crossed a line she could no longer ignore. Her voice came quiet but steady. "You know, Evan," she said, "I've given this company everything I have. My time, my weekends, my health, even my peace. And if that still isn't enough, maybe you're right. Maybe this isn't the right place for me." He blinked the faintest sign of surprise. "Don't be dramatic. Claire, I'm talking about standards." "No," she said softly. "You're talking about control, and I'm done letting it define me." The air between them thickened. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then she reached for her ID badge, unclipped it from her lanyard, and set it gently on his desk. "I'm resigning, effective immediately." His jaw tightened. He looked at her as if trying to calculate whether she was serious. "You're overreacting," he said, the first hint of uncertainty threading through his tone, but she only shook her head. "No, Evan, I'm finally reacting. There's a difference." He stood there tall, unyielding, but his eyes shifted, just slightly, like someone glimpsing a reflection they didn't expect to see. For the first time since she'd known him, he didn't have a quick reply. The silence stretched. The hum of the air conditioner filled the space where old patterns used to live. Then Claire picked up her purse. She took one last look at the view behind him, the endless sprawl of the city, sunlight glinting off the bay, and said, quietly, "I wish you the best. Evan, truly." And with that, she turned and walked out. Her footsteps echoed down the marble corridor. She felt shaky, almost weightless the way you feel after standing up too fast. Freedom, she realized, isn't always triumphant. Sometimes it's just stillness. At the elevator, her reflection looked back at her. The same gray blazer, the same tired eyes, but there was something new in her expression now. A spark, a quiet defiance. The doors slid open, and she stepped inside. As the numbers descended, 30, 22, 10, lobby. Claire exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. Outside, the air was cool and bright. Cars rushed past, somewhere. A street musician played an old blues tune on his guitar. She stood for a while, coffee in hand, watching people hurry towards something she no longer chased. And though her heart trembled, a small voice inside whispered steady, insistent, "You did the right thing." Upstairs, in the glass tower, Evan Mercer stood at his window, staring at the empty chair where Claire had sat for years. His reflection in the glass stared back composed, efficient, unreadable. But for a fleeting second, something shifted in his gaze. A question, a flicker of regret. A confusion he couldn't quite name. And though he'd never admit it out loud, he knew that something, perhaps the only thing keeping him human, had just walked out that door. That evening, the office lights dimmed one by one, like stars fading at dawn. Most of the staff had gone home. The corridors were quiet now, only the low hum of machines, the faint smell of paper and coffee left behind. Claire's desk sat in the far corner, neat as always, her nameplate, the framed photo of Milo, the ceramic mug she'd had since her first day, small artifacts of a life built in this place. She opened the top drawer, slowly packing each item into a cardboard box. The motions were careful, almost reverent. It was strange. She thought how something could feel heavy and freeing at the same time. Each sound in that silent office seemed louder, the rustle of folders, the soft thud of pens, the click of her watch as she moved. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath, watching her leave. She paused for a moment, looking out the window. Seattle's skyline glowed in the distance, lights reflecting off the bay. She wondered how many of those offices were filled with people like her, tired, loyal, quietly fading behind the glass. She should have felt proud. She had stood up for herself. And yet, there was an ache beneath the relief. Not regret, but the hollow ache of an ending. She was sealing the last box when the elevator bell chimed. Footsteps echoed down the hall. She didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Claire? His voice was calm, but there was a current beneath it, something uncertain, almost human. She turned slowly. Evan Mercer stood there in his usual dark suit, tie loosened, expression unreadable. The man who had humiliated her yesterday now looked, somehow, less sure of himself. "I thought you'd gone home," she said quietly. "I did," he replied. "But I realized we never finished our conversation." She gave a tired smile. "I think we did. Evan, I resigned. You accepted." He stepped closer, his gaze steady. "I didn't accept. Not officially." Her hand froze on the box. "Does it matter?" "It does," he said. "Because you're making a mistake." A short laugh escaped her, weary and sad. "That's ironic. I thought you believed mistakes were unacceptable." He didn't react to the sting in her tone. Instead, he leaned against the edge of her desk, crossing his arms. "You've worked here 6 years. Claire, you know what this place is built on. We're days away from finalizing the Japan partnership, the biggest deal in Brightline's history. I need you to stay on through the end of next week. Just one more week." She looked at him, searching his face for mockery, but saw only tension. "So, now you need me. I need your steadiness," he said simply. "And your judgment. You know the project better than anyone. It would be reckless to let you walk out midstream." She exhaled slowly, feeling that old tug between pride and responsibility. It was always the same battle, her sense of duty against her bruised self-respect. "You don't get to demand that from me," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I'm not demanding," he said. "I'm asking." For a moment, they just stood there, the hum of the city beneath them. Claire studied him, the perfectionist, the control-driven leader, but there was something new in his tone, something that almost sounded like humility. Still, her heart resisted. "Why should I do this?" "Evan, you've made it clear what you think of me." He hesitated, looked away, then back. "Because you care about the work," he said, "and because whether you want to admit it or not, walking out like this isn't you. You don't quit halfway through." The words hit a nerve. He wasn't wrong. She had always finished what she started. It was her compass, her code. But this time, finishing meant working side by side with the man who'd broken her trust, pretending nothing had changed. She looked down at the box again, fingers tracing the edge. A week, she thought. 7 days. Maybe it wasn't about him at all. Maybe it was about her, about closing this chapter on her own terms. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm. "All right," she said. 1 week. I'll stay to finish the deal, but not for you, Evan, for the work, for the people who still believe in what this company could be." He nodded once, relief flickering across his face, so brief it almost disappeared. "Fair enough." "And after that," she added, "I'm gone. No debates, no negotiations. Understood." For the first time, their exchange ended without sharpness, just a quiet understanding that neither could quite name. He straightened his tie, as if collecting himself, and turned to leave. At the doorway, he paused. "Thank you." "Claire." She didn't answer, only gave a small nod, her expression unreadable. When he was gone, the silence returned, but it felt different now, not empty, but waiting. She looked around her desk once more, the photo of Milo, the papers still warm from her hands, and deep inside, she knew this was more than a deal. This was her final test, not of endurance, but of grace. She reached for her coat, switched off the desk lamp, and whispered to the dark room, "One last week." Then she walked out, the echo of her heels soft against the marble floor, each step carrying her toward the end of something, and perhaps the beginning of something else. The next morning came quietly, no grand beginning, no burst of light, just the steady gray dawn that brushed across Seattle's skyline and pressed against the tall windows of Brightline Innovations. For Claire Whitman, it felt like the start of something she hadn't named, yet not quite a return, not yet forgiveness, but a kind of truce with herself. She arrived early, earlier than she ever had before. The building was almost silent, the kind of silence that comes before the city wakes. The only sound was the low whir of the elevators and the faint hum of lights flickering to life. She carried her bag, her thermos of coffee, and that same quiet resolve that had brought her here. A week, that's all she had promised. 7 days to close the deal. 7 days to prove not to him, but to herself, that she could walk away with her dignity intact. When the elevator doors opened onto the 30th floor, she stopped short. Evan Mercer was already there. He stood near the window, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, a faint reflection of the city moving behind him. His desk was lined with documents, color-coded charts, and 2 cups of coffee, one black, one with a dash of cinnamon. She noticed the second cup immediately. He turned when he heard her footsteps. "Morning," he said. His voice was even, polite, stripped of its usual command. "Morning," she replied, placing her bag beside her desk. Her tone matched his courteous, distant, careful. For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them was almost tangible, filled with everything that hadn't been said the night before. Then, as if by silent agreement, they both turned to their work. The hours stretched in measured quiet, the scratch of a pen, the rustle of pages, the soft ping of incoming emails, no arguments, no clipped remarks. Just the sound of 2 professionals trying to navigate the fragile space between pride and civility. Yet, beneath that silence, something was shifting, subtle, almost invisible, like the slow turning of a tide. Claire focused on her notes, her pen moving in neat, deliberate strokes. She wasn't trying to impress him anymore. She was simply doing what she'd always done best, bringing order to chaos, finding clarity where others saw noise. She color-coded schedules, flagged inconsistencies, reorganized data points that no one else had noticed. It wasn't about recognition now. It was about reclaiming a sense of self she'd lost somewhere along the way. Evan, meanwhile, watched her in small, unguarded moments when she leaned over her notes, when she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, when she paused before speaking, always choosing her words with care. He'd seen her work for years, but somehow, he'd never really seen her. Not like this, not without the filter of authority between them. There was something steady in her presence, something the numbers, the deadlines, the noise of leadership couldn't provide. It unsettled him in ways he didn't fully understand. At one point, a junior analyst knocked, asking for guidance on a report. Evan started to answer, but Claire gently interjected. "If we reformat the presentation by client focus instead of department, it'll align better with the investor priorities," she said softly. The analyst nodded. "Got it. Thank you. Claire." Evan said nothing. He just watched as the young employee left, clearly relieved. When the door closed, he glanced at her. "You always know how to make things sound simple," he said quietly. She didn't look up from her notes. "They're not simple. I just try to make them less confusing." He almost smiled. Almost. The clock ticked on. Midday light poured through the glass, glinting off metal edges and paper stacks. By noon, the office began to stir again, voices rising, phones ringing, footsteps crossing marble floors. But for those few hours, it had been just the 2 of them, a fragile piece built on unspoken boundaries. When she finally stood to stretch, Evan looked up from his laptop. "You're still working on the investor prep deck." "Yes," she said. "It needs tightening." "Some of your points repeat on slide 15. He raised a brow. "They do." She nodded. "I removed the redundancy." "Good call," he murmured. Then came something unexpected, a moment of stillness that felt almost warm. "Claire," he said after a pause, "I didn't thank you yesterday for agreeing to stay." She met his eyes for the first time that morning. "You didn't have to," she said. "I'm not doing it for you." "I know," he replied, and somehow she believed him. The afternoon sun shifted, painting soft gold on the office walls. Outside, the city roared to life. Inside, the silence between them changed shape, no longer cold, but thoughtful, like the quiet between 2 notes of music. For the first time in months, Claire felt something she hadn't felt in a long while, a sense of inner steadiness. Not happiness, not forgiveness, just peace. As she gathered her papers at the end of the day, she glanced once more toward the window. Evan was still at his desk, typing, absorbed. But when she reached for her coat, he looked up. Their eyes met. No words, just a simple, human acknowledgement. Outside, the evening light was soft and forgiving, and as she stepped into the elevator, Claire felt a quiet certainty rising within her, gentle but unmistakable. Sometimes, healing doesn't begin with an apology. Sometimes, it begins with silence and the decision to stay strong within it. The days that followed moved with quiet rhythm, a rhythm that surprised them both. What began as an uneasy truce slowly unfolded into something more, bearable, even, at times, steady. Each morning, Claire arrived before the city was fully awake, and each morning, Evan was already there, sleeves rolled up, jacket on the back of his chair, the faint aroma of coffee and concentration hanging in the air. They spoke little at first. The silence between them had become something of an agreement unspoken, but understood. Yet with each passing day, that silence softened, not warmth, not yet, but familiarity. On the fifth morning, a Tuesday, the calm was broken by urgency. The investor presentation, the one that would decide the company's partnership with Japan, was in 2 days. It would be the biggest meeting of Evan's career. And for Claire, the last major task before she walked away. She stood beside him in the conference room, laptop open, the projector humming, charts, numbers, and slides filled the wall, impressive, precise, and, to her eye, a little too sterile. Evan clicked through the slides, his voice, even, rehearsed. We'll lead with the growth metrics, then pivot to operational strategy. The investors will expect confidence and technical detail. Claire listened quietly. When he paused, she said gently, "Evan, they already know the numbers." He turned toward her. "That's the point." She shook her head. "No, the point is trust. They want to know who they're working with, not just what we're selling." He raised an eyebrow, half curiosity, half irritation. "You think they care about feelings? I think they care about people," she said. "And right now, this presentation feels like a machine talking to a room full of machines." A long silence stretched between them. She could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to touch. Her heart thudded in her chest, but she didn't look away. Evan folded his arms, studying her. No one in his team ever contradicted him so directly, especially not her. Finally, he exhaled, a quiet sigh through his nose. "Go on," encouraged. She stepped closer to the screen. "These slides, they're flawless, but they're cold. What if we tell a story instead? About why Brightline started, about the human side of innovation. Your mother's idea, wasn't it? The one about design serving people, not replacing them." Evan's expression shifted the faintest flicker of surprise. "You remember that? I remember everything you said the day I joined," she replied softly. "You talked about purpose, somewhere along the way. That disappeared from your tone. Her words weren't cruel. They were calm. Honest the way truth should sound when spoken by someone who means no harm." He turned back to the wall of slides, eyes moving across the neat graphs, the immaculate lines, and suddenly, they seemed hollow. "What would you change?" he asked quietly. Claire smiled faintly. "Let me show you for the next hour." She worked beside him, reshaping the presentation piece by piece. She swapped charts for images that told a story, designs in use, teams collaborating, customers smiling. She added a slide titled "Innovation with Heart." At first, he resisted questioning, adjusting, pushing back on every change. But slowly, something shifted. He began to listen. He even asked her opinion. And somewhere in that long morning, amid spreadsheets and rewrites, they began to sound less like boss and employee, and more like equals. By noon, the presentation was completely transformed. Evan stepped back, studying the wall of slides now glowing with color and warmth. "It's different," he said at last. "It's real," Claire replied. He nodded once, the hint of a reluctant smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "We'll try it your way." When he said your way, she felt something stir inside, not pride, but a quiet recognition. For years, she'd been invisible in these rooms, her ideas folded neatly behind the success of others. Now, for the first time, her voice carried weight. That afternoon, they rehearsed together. The energy in the room was sharper now, focused, alive. Evan stumbled once on a phrase she'd written, then looked up, almost sheepishly. "You really think they'll respond to this?" "I don't think," she said. "I know." He gave a soft laugh, short, genuine. It startled them both. As the day faded into evening, they finished the final run-through. When the last slide disappeared and the room went dark, Claire reached for the laptop. But Evan spoke first. "Thank you," he said simply. She turned to him, surprised by the tone, not formal, not polite, but sincere. "For what?" "For reminding me what this is all supposed to be about." For a moment, their eyes met, no longer adversaries, not yet friends. Just two people standing on the thin bridge between misunderstanding and respect. Outside, the city lights blinked awake. The office reflected them, soft, shimmering, alive. And as Claire packed her things, she realized something unexpected. For the first time in a long while, she didn't dread coming back tomorrow. She glanced at him before leaving. He was still at the table, looking at the slides they had built together. He didn't notice her watching, but she saw the faintest change in his expression, something softer, quieter. Maybe it was admiration. Maybe it was just awareness. But whatever it was, it marked a beginning not born of romance or apology, but of something rarer, respect. That night, the city glimmered beneath a soft drizzle, a quiet rain that turned every light into a watercolor blur. Inside the 30th floor of Brightline Innovations, the office was nearly empty. Only the hum of computers and the faint ticking of a wall clock filled the air. Claire should have gone home hours ago, but the presentation was tomorrow, and there were still details to polish, small things, invisible to most, but not to her. So she stayed, across the room. Evan was still there too. His jacket hung on the back of a chair, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened. His desk, usually pristine, was now scattered with notes and open folders. For a long while, they worked in silence, two figures framed against the glow of the city. Occasionally, their eyes met across the room, just brief glances. Nothing more, but the air between them had changed. The sharp edges from before had softened into something quieter. At one point, she looked up and said lightly, "You know, for someone who's allergic to imperfection, you make quite a mess when you work late." He looked around, papers everywhere, coffee cups, an open laptop blinking with reminders, and let out a soft laugh. Fair point. The sound startled her, not because it was loud, but because it was real. She couldn't remember ever hearing him laugh before. "Don't tell anyone," he added, with a faint smile. "It might ruin my reputation." She smiled back. "Your secret's safe with me." Something eased between them, then a small, unspoken truce in the long war of professionalism. The clock ticked past 9. The hum of the city outside became a low rhythm against the glass. After a while, Evan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "You ever notice," he said quietly, "how success gets louder the higher you climb, and somehow you hear less of yourself?" Claire paused, pen in hand. "Yes," she said softly. "All the time." He looked at her for a moment, as if weighing whether to say more. Then, in a voice lower than before, he continued, "My mother used to paint," he said. "She'd stay up late, just like this. I'd watch her in her studio, the way she'd mix colors, always humming under her breath. She died when I was 12. Claire said nothing, only listened, her pen resting against her notebook. "My father," he went on, was a numbers man, brilliant but cold. He believed emotion was weakness. So I learned to build walls instead. He gave a quiet or self-deprecating laugh. Guess I got too good at it. The words hung there, raw and honest, cutting through the hum of machines. Claire felt something shift inside her, a recognition, deep and familiar. She knew that kind of loneliness, the kind that hides beneath achievement, the kind that looks like strength, but feels like exile. She leaned back in her chair, studying him not as a boss, not even as a man, but as another human being carrying invisible weight. "I'm sorry," she said gently. "Losing a mother that young, that leaves a shadow." He nodded, eyes distant. "It does. You learn to fill the silence any way you can work. Control. Perfection. But it's just noise." "Really?" Her throat tightened. "I understand." He looked up then, meeting her eyes fully. "Do you—" She hesitated. Then, quietly, "Yes. My marriage ended the same way your walls began, in silence. You tell yourself you're fine, that being alone means peace. But really, it's just quieter noise." For a moment, neither spoke. The honesty between them felt fragile, a small flame flickering in a vast, cold room. Evan broke the silence with a faint smile. "You make it sound poetic." She smiled back. "Maybe because pain always has rhythm. We just pretend not to hear it." And then, unexpectedly, beautifully, they both laughed. Not the careful, polite laughter of coworkers, but something lighter, true. The sound echoed softly in the empty office, blending with the rain tapping on the windows. When it faded, they sat quietly, both feeling that rare peace that comes when two guarded souls stop pretending. He glanced at the clock. "It's past 10, he said. "You should head home, so should you." He gave a soft shrug. "Home's just another quiet room." She hesitated, then said, "Maybe that's something you can change." He looked at her, the steadiness in her eyes, the compassion she didn't try to hide, and for a brief, disarming second, he didn't look like a CEO at all. He looked like a man trying to remember what it meant to be human. "Maybe," he said finally. Claire gathered her things, switching off the lamp beside her. The room dimmed to a warm twilight glow. As she walked to the elevator, she glanced back once. Evan was still by the window, looking out at the rain, one hand in his pocket, and though neither spoke another word, something had shifted between them. The armor had cracked, not shattered, but softened, and through those quiet cracks, something almost forgotten began to seep in. Not romance, not yet, something simpler, something stronger, understanding. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the skyline, sharp, clean, unfiltered. It was the kind of light that made glass towers look like they were made of air. Claire stood by the window, coffee in hand, watching the city wake. After the night before, something inside her felt different, still cautious, still careful, but lighter somehow, as if the weight she'd been carrying had shifted, ever so slightly, into balance. When she arrived at Brightline Innovations, the energy on the 30th floor was electric. Today was the day. The investor meeting, the one that could decide the company's future. Staff hurried down the hallways, arms full of reports and tablets. The air buzzed with tension and caffeine. Evan was already in the conference room, reviewing last-minute details. His posture was as precise as ever, but there was something calmer about him now, less steel, more focus. Claire entered quietly, setting her notebook beside him. He looked up. "Morning, morning," she replied. Their eyes met for a brief moment, an acknowledgement of what had passed between them the night before. No words, just understanding. He gestured toward a chair at the table. His table. "I want you sitting in," he said simply. She hesitated. "Evan, that's not you've earned it," he interrupted, his tone firm but warm. "You know this project better than anyone. You should be part of the conversation." She blinked. surprised. For 6 years, she'd been the quiet one at the edge of the room, the note-taker, the organizer, the unseen backbone of every success. Now, for the first time, she was being invited to sit as an equal. The clock struck 10, the doors opened, and the delegation from Tokyo entered 5 men in dark suits, followed by 2 translators and an assistant carrying files. Formal bows, polite greetings. The scent of cologne and crisp paper filled the air. The meeting began. Evan opened with confidence, his presentation smooth and deliberate. The new slides, the ones Claire had helped design, glowed on the screen. Innovation with heart. It was cleaner, more human. Even the investors seemed intrigued. For the first hour, everything went perfectly. Until it didn't. A question came quiet, precise from the senior Japanese investor, Mr. Takahashi. He leaned forward, hands folded. "Mr. Mercer," he said through the translator, "we are impressed with your numbers. But I'm curious, what does heart mean to you in business?" Evan froze for just a fraction of a second. It was the kind of question that couldn't be answered with statistics. It needed something deeper, something real. He began to speak, his voice steady but uncertain. "It means integrity, connection." But the words felt rehearsed, hollow. Even he seemed to hear it. The room grew still, the kind of silence that makes every breath sound too loud. Claire's pulse quickened. She could feel the tension thickening, the deal slipping inch by inch. Then, quietly, she spoke. "If I may," she said, turning slightly toward the investors. Every eye in the room turned to her, including Evan's. She continued, calm but clear. "When we say innovation with heart, we mean creating technology that serves people, not replaces them. Mr. Mercer's mother was an artist. She believed design should make life warmer, not colder. That belief still lives here, in how we build, how we lead, and how we listen." She paused, then added softly, "At Brightline, progress isn't just about speed. It's about empathy, about seeing the person on the other side of the data." The translator's voice carried her words into Japanese, and for a moment, the room was utterly silent. Then a smile. "Mr. Takahashi nodded slowly. "That," he said, "is what we wanted to hear." The tension broke like a wave. The rest of the meeting flowed effortlessly. Questions turned into conversation, and conversation turned into laughter. By the end, handshakes replaced hesitation. The deal was done. As the investors filed out, Evan turned to Claire. He didn't speak right away, just looked at her long enough for her to feel the quiet weight of what had just happened. "Finally," he said, low and certain, "you just saved the deal." She smiled faintly. "I just told the truth." He nodded. "Sometimes that's the hardest thing to do." Their eyes met again, longer this time, lingering, no power, no distance, just 2 people seeing each other clearly for the first time. Outside, the city pulsed with late morning light. Inside the glass tower, something had shifted, invisible but undeniable. For years, Evan Mercer had led with control. Today, he'd been saved by something he couldn't control at all. Honesty, spoken softly by a woman he'd once overlooked. And as Claire gathered her notes, ready to leave the room, he found himself watching her with quiet admiration. Not because she'd been right, though she had, but because she'd been real. Later, as the team celebrated, laughter echoing through the hallways, Evan stood by the window again, looking out over the city. The glass reflected both the skyline and his own faint smile. For the first time in a long while, he felt something unfamiliar, something fragile respect. Yes, but also gratitude. And somewhere in that moment, he realized the walls he'd spent a lifetime building were not unbreakable after all. Sometimes, it only takes one honest voice to remind you what being human sounds like. The evening after the investor meeting carried a stillness that felt almost sacred. The deal had gone through sealed with smiles, handshakes, and congratulations echoing across the 30th floor. For Brightline Innovations, it was a triumph. But for Claire, it was something else entirely. It felt like the end of a long storm, one she hadn't realized she'd been standing in until the air finally cleared. As the others celebrated downstairs, she lingered in the quiet conference room, packing up the last of the presentation files. The city stretched out below her, silver lights rippling across the bay. It was strange, she thought, how success could feel both exhilarating and lonely. The door opened softly behind her. She didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Still working, Evan's voice was low, tired, but softer than she remembered. "Just finishing up," she said, sliding the laptop into its case. "You should be downstairs. They're celebrating you." He gave a faint, almost embarrassed smile. "They're celebrating us." She turned to look at him, the man who had once humiliated her in front of a room, now standing with his hands in his pockets, humility flickering across his face like a new language he was still learning to speak. For a moment, neither said anything. The hum of the city filled the space between them. Then she asked the question that had been quietly pressing against her thoughts for days. "Why did you fight so hard to keep me here?" Her tone was steady, but underneath it, there was something raw, a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. Evan looked at her, eyes unreadable. "Because you're the only one who ever told me the truth." The simplicity of it caught her off guard. "The truth," she repeated softly. He nodded. "Everyone else tells me what I want to hear. You never did. You challenged me, even when it cost you." Claire studied him, trying to decide if this was another one of his well-crafted answers, another tactic in the language of leadership. But there was something unpolished in his tone, something almost vulnerable. She crossed her arms, leaning against the table. "You say that like it's a compliment?" "It is," he said. "I built this company on precision, on control, but somewhere along the way, I forgot that truth isn't perfect. It's uncomfortable. It asks for humility. You reminded me of that." She gave a faint smile, one corner of her mouth lifting. "That wasn't exactly my goal." "Maybe not," he said quietly, "but it's what happened." The words hung there, simple, sincere, impossible to ignore. Outside, rain began to fall again, a soft tapping against the glass. The sound filled the pauses between their sentences, steady and intimate. Claire took a slow breath. "You're changing," she said, almost to herself. Evan tilted his head slightly. "Am I?" She hesitated. "I don't know. Sometimes I think you are. Other times, I wonder if this is just another strategy." He didn't flinch. "That's fair." She looked at him, surprised by the honesty. "You're not going to defend yourself." He shook his head. "No, you've seen me at my worst. Words won't fix that. Only time will." That silence again, deep, unhurried, full of meaning. She looked down at her hands, remembering the first day she'd brought him coffee, the reports, the corrections, the long years of being invisible. Now, standing here, she realized how much had changed and how much hadn't. "I don't want to be your project, Evan," she said softly. "I don't want to be the lesson you learned before going back to being who you were." He took a step closer, but not too close. "You're not," he said. "You're the reminder of who I was supposed to be." Her breath caught not from romance, but from recognition, because beneath his words, she heard truth, and truth, she knew, always carried its own kind of tenderness. The rain outside grew heavier, streaking down the glass in silvery lines. Neither of them moved. For a long moment, it was just the sound of the rain, the soft hum of city lights, and the quiet awareness growing between them. He finally spoke again, voice barely above a whisper. "You know, when you walked out that day, I thought it was over. But it wasn't about losing an employee. It was about losing something I didn't know I needed." "What's that?" she asked. He met her gaze. "Someone who saw through me and stayed long enough to say what I didn't want to hear." Her chest tightened. She wanted to believe him. Part of her already did. But another part, the part that had learned to protect itself, stayed cautious. "People don't change overnight," she said. "I know," he replied, "but maybe they can start in one." His voice was quiet, steady, not persuasive, just real. And somehow, that made her believe him more than any promise could. Claire turned back to the window, watching the city blur through the rain. In the reflection, she could see him behind her, his outline, his stillness. Something about that image, two people framed by glass and weather, felt like a question the world itself was asking. Were they crossing paths, or finally walking in the same direction? She didn't have an answer, not yet, but as she turned to leave, she gave him one small truth of her own. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For listening." He nodded once, and the faintest smile touched his lips. "Anytime, Claire." And as she stepped into the elevator, the doors closing slowly between them, both of them stood in the soft, golden light, each wondering the same unspoken thing. Maybe this was the start of something neither of them had expected. Not redemption, not romance, but something rarer, a second chance to be real. The rest of the week passed like the slow turning of a page. The tension that once filled the 30th floor had eased into something quieter, almost human. Claire and Evan spoke more freely now, their conversations laced with small silences that no longer felt uncomfortable. It wasn't friendship yet. It was something subtler, the fragile bridge that begins to form when two people stop hiding behind what used to protect them. On Friday evening, as the sun slipped low behind the skyline, Evan appeared at Claire's desk. He held his phone, hesitating a moment before speaking. "There's an exhibit this weekend," he said, "at the Seattle Art Museum, Modern Impressionists. My mother, she used to love that kind of thing." Claire looked up, surprised by the softness in his tone. "You're going?" He nodded. "I thought I might. Would you like to come?" "For a heartbeat?" She said nothing. It wasn't the kind of invitation she'd expected, not professional, not romantic, just human. After a pause, she smiled faintly. "Sure. I'd like that." Saturday came dressed in sunlight, the kind of warm, forgiving light that makes even glass towers seem gentle. Claire arrived early, wearing a soft gray coat and a silk scarf the color of lavender. When Evan greeted her at the entrance, he wasn't in a suit for once, just a navy sweater, jeans, and a simple watch. He looked younger somehow, or maybe just lighter. Inside, the museum was quiet, filled with the hush of footsteps and the occasional murmur of appreciation. Paintings lined the walls, soft brush strokes, golden light, the poetry of color and shadow. They walked slowly, side by side, without needing to fill every silence. At one point, Evan stopped before a painting, a small, luminous portrait of a woman seated by a window, sunlight spilling across her hands. "My mother painted like this," he said quietly. "Soft. Always light first. Detail later." She said it was the only way to make sadness look honest. Claire turned to look at him. She must have been extraordinary. He gave a small smile. She was. But she spent her whole life trying to be seen. My father never understood her work. He called it impractical. He paused, voice dipping lower. When she died, he threw most of her paintings away, said they were just memories. Claire's chest ached at the quiet grief in his words. "That must have been hard." He nodded. "It taught me something, that losing beauty isn't just about art. It's about forgetting what it felt like to feel." They stood there for a long moment, the painting glowing softly in front of them. Then Claire spoke, her voice gentle, but certain. "I know that kind of forgetting," she said. "It's what happens when you survive too much silence." Evan looked at her, curious. She continued, her words slow and measured. "My marriage ended that way, not with anger, just absence. Two people who stopped listening to each other until the quiet got too loud." She gave a small, almost apologetic laugh. "You wake up one day and realize you've become invisible in your own life." He didn't interrupt, didn't try to fix it. He simply listened, and in that stillness, she found herself saying things she hadn't said out loud in years. "I used to think love was about holding on," she said softly. "Now, I think maybe it's about being seen not perfectly, just truthfully. That's harder than people realize." Evan's gaze softened. "Maybe that's why my mother painted light to see what people hide from themselves." They moved to another room, one filled with landscapes, the kind that seemed to breathe. The light filtered through tall windows, catching on the edges of their coats, the floor gleaming beneath their steps. There was no pretense here, no office, no power, just two people standing quietly inside a world made of color and silence. At one point, Claire stopped before a small painting of a harbor at dawn, boats adrift in soft fog, the sky a mix of rose and gray. She whispered, almost to herself, "It feels like healing." Evan followed her gaze. "It does." They lingered there, side by side, the hush between them filled with something tender, not romantic, not yet, but profoundly human. He glanced at her then, and for the first time, she saw at the gentleness behind the precision, the man beneath the armor, and perhaps he saw something, too, the strength in her quiet, the grace in her restraint. When they finally stepped outside, the afternoon had turned golden. The air smelled faintly of rain and magnolia. The city moved around them, buses sighing, people laughing, the faint hum of weekend life. They walked without hurry, no titles, no history, just steps in sync. At the corner cafe, Evan held the door for her. "Coffee?" She smiled. "Why not?" Inside, they found a small table by the window. Sunlight spilled across the tablecloth, catching the steam from their cups. For a while, they talked about art, about their mothers, about the way time can both wound and soften. Claire laughed once, a sound that made him look up, surprised, then quietly pleased. As the afternoon faded into a warm twilight, he said, almost to himself, "Funny how healing doesn't look like you expect it to." Claire tilted her head. "How does it look to you?" He paused, then smiled, faintly. "Like this?" She didn't reply, just held his gaze for a long, quiet moment. Outside, the light dimmed, the reflections of the city flickering in the glass. And in that small space between conversation and silence, between memory and forgiveness, something fragile and new began to take root. Not a grand revelation, just a gentle truth that two people, scarred and searching, can still find beauty in what remains. The following week unfolded with a quiet, steady rhythm. The deal with the Japanese investors had gone through, and Brightline was basking in its success. But for Evan Mercer, something deeper had shifted, something that couldn't be measured in profits or press releases. The man who once moved through the halls with sharp precision now walked a little slower. He listened more, he interrupted less. And though his expression still carried that familiar intensity, there was something new beneath it, a softness, faint but unmistakable. Claire noticed the difference long before anyone else did. He began to ask about the team, not just their work, but their lives. He made a point to thank the interns after presentations, to check in with the design staff he'd once intimidated without realizing it. It wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, like a man learning how to speak a forgotten language. One afternoon, she watched from her desk as he stood with a young analyst who'd made a mistake in the quarterly report. Months ago, he would have sliced through the error like a scalpel, but this time, he simply leaned over, reviewed the numbers, and said, "We'll fix it together." Claire found herself smiling, just a small, private smile. Change, she thought, rarely announces itself. It just begins, quietly, in the small places where pride used to live. Still, despite this shift, a certain distance lingered between them. After the art museum, after that rare moment of shared truth, neither had spoken about it again. Some things, she knew, didn't need to be named right away. Until one night. It was late, the kind of late when the office feels like another world. The city outside was a constellation of lights. and the air inside hummed faintly with the sound of servers and faraway traffic. Claire had stayed behind to finish a quarterly review. Evan was still there too, as usual, standing by the window with a folder in his hand. The reflection of the skyline played across his face, fractured by glass. She glanced up. "You should go home," she said gently. He gave a tired smile. "That's starting to sound familiar." She chuckled softly. "That's because you keep ignoring it." He turned then, really looking at her. "It's easier to work than to think." She set her pen down. "That's not always true. Sometimes working is how we think." He walked toward her desk, each step slow, deliberate. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost uncertain. "Claire, there's something I should say." She waited, sensing the shift in his tone. "I've been cruel," he said simply. "To people, to you. And it wasn't because I didn't care. It was because I was scared." The words landed softly but carried the weight of years. Scared of what she asked, barely above a whisper. He exhaled, eyes distant, of being wrong, of being seen, of failing at something I couldn't control. He looked down for a moment, then back at her. "When my mother died, I learned early that control was safety. If I could manage everything, the numbers, the outcomes, the people, nothing could fall apart again. Except," he paused, "everything did." Claire felt something tighten in her chest, that quiet ache of recognition. She had spent years building her own kind of armor: steadiness, composure, self-sufficiency, different tools, same purpose. She wanted to tell him she understood. That fear of losing control wasn't weakness. It was the residue of heartbreak. But the words stayed lodged in her throat. Instead, she met his gaze steady, kind, and just a little wounded. He gave a faint, humorless laugh. "I've been told I'm hard to work for." She smiled softly. "That's one way to put it. I used to think that fear made me stronger," he said. "Now I see it just made me smaller." For a long moment, silence filled the room, but it wasn't empty. It was full of what hadn't been said before. Claire finally spoke, her voice low and even. "You don't owe me an apology, Evan. Maybe not," he said, "but I needed to say it anyway." There was a pause. Then, almost shyly, he added, "The truth is, you changed this place. You changed me." Her breath caught. "That wasn't my intention, I know," he said softly. "Maybe that's why it worked." Outside, the rain began again, a soft percussion against the glass. Familiar now, almost comforting. The city shimmered in reflections. Inside, the light from her desk lamp pooled across the table, warm and golden. She wanted to tell him she saw his effort, that he wasn't alone in trying to be better, but instead, she said nothing. Some moments, she knew, didn't need words to matter. So, they sat there, two people who had spent a lifetime hiding behind competence, now sharing a silence that finally felt safe. It was the kind of silence that held everything: forgiveness, gratitude, and something quieter still: understanding. When she finally stood to leave, she gathered her things and said softly, "Good night, Evan." He looked up, eyes gentle. "Good night, Claire." As she walked toward the elevator, she heard him move back toward the window, and though she didn't turn around, she could almost feel it the moment when he let out the breath he'd been holding for years. The night stretched around them, soft, infinite, still, and somewhere in that silence, a new truth took root. Sometimes, healing doesn't sound like a speech. Sometimes, it sounds like the quiet that follows an honest confession. The next morning, sunlight crept slowly across the skyline, soft, golden, and deliberate, as if it too understood that endings require gentleness. Brightline Innovations was quieter than usual. The project, months of intensity, tension, and triumph, was complete. The deal signed, the investors satisfied, the numbers soaring. There was only one day left in what Evan had once called the week of closure. But for Claire, it had become something else: a week of awakening. She moved through the corridors with calm precision, greeting familiar faces, gathering files for the final presentation. Yet, beneath that calm, a restlessness stirred the kind that comes when you've reached the edge of something that no longer fits. By late afternoon, the team gathered in the conference room one last time. Applause filled the air, not loud, but warm. Gratitude rippled through the staff, soft smiles replacing the old anxiety that had once haunted this floor. Evan stood at the head of the table, thanking each department, his voice steady, thoughtful. When his gaze found Claire, he paused. "None of this would have happened without you," he said simply. The room fell quiet. She gave a small, polite nod, her heart beating a little faster. She wasn't used to being seen in rooms like this, not as a helper, but as an equal. After the meeting, when the others had left, Evan lingered by the window. The city beyond was beginning to blush with evening light. He turned as she gathered her things. "Claire," he said, "do you have a moment?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Of course." He gestured to a chair near his desk, the same desk where months ago he'd once humiliated her. Now, the space between them felt different, not cold, but quiet, expectant. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice low, deliberate. "About what happens after tomorrow." She smiled faintly. "You'll be fine. You always are." He shook his head. "That's not what I meant." He studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "I'd like you to stay, Claire, not as my assistant, as my partner, vice president of operations." The words hung in the air, soft but heavy. For a moment, she didn't move, didn't breathe. He continued, his gaze steady. "You've led this team in ways I never could. You understand people, not just processes, and this company. It needs that now more than ever." Her heart trembled with something that felt like disbelief. She wanted to feel proud, and she did. But tangled within, that pride was uncertainty, even fear. This offer wasn't just a promotion. It was an invitation into a future she wasn't sure she wanted anymore. "Evan," she said finally, her voice careful, "you don't need to do this because you feel grateful." He shook his head. I'm doing it because I finally see what you bring, and I can't imagine this place without it." The sincerity in his tone left no space for argument. Still, she hesitated. "I'll think about it." He nodded. "That's all I ask." That night, Claire sat by the window of her small apartment, the city lights shimmering against the dark water of Lake Union. The street lamps along the shore cast long, trembling reflections, threads of gold rippling across the surface like veins of memory. She wrapped her hands around a cup of tea, its warmth seeping slowly into her palms. On the table lay her old leather journal pages worn soft from years of silence. She opened it and began to write. 20 years in offices that never felt like mine. 20 years of holding my breath to keep the peace. 20 years of listening, of carrying, of enduring. Her handwriting wavered slightly. Then, beneath it, she wrote, "Maybe this time, it's not about endurance. Maybe it's about choice." She set the pen down and leaned back, eyes drifting to the city outside. From this height, the lake looked like a sheet of glass, perfect on the surface. But beneath it, movement, current, life, truth beneath the surface, she thought. The phrase echoed in her mind, steady and insistent. For so long, she had lived on that surface efficient, composed, safe. Now, something within her was calling to the depths, to the part of herself she'd hidden in exchange for acceptance. Her reflection in the window looked older, wiser, softer. And she wondered if this was what growth truly looked like, not a sudden burst of courage, but a quiet return to one's own truth. Milo, her aging golden retriever, stirred from his spot by the couch, padding over to rest his head on her knee. She smiled, gently scratching behind his ear. "I don't know what I'll do yet," she whispered, "but whatever it is, it'll be for me this time." The city lights shimmered in agreement. She thought of Evan, his confession, his humility, the way his voice had softened when he'd said, "I was scared, She believed him, but belief didn't mean surrender, because she knew, perhaps for the first time, that she had choices. As midnight drew near, she closed the journal, whispering to the darkness, one more day, tomorrow, she would walk into that building for the last time, or perhaps, for the first time, as herself. Either way, it would be her decision. And as she looked once more at the shimmering reflection of streetlights across the lake, she saw it clearly, the image of her own truth, finally rising to the surface. Morning came quietly, the kind of morning that doesn't demand attention, but gently finds its way through curtains and thoughts alike. Claire woke before the alarm, the air cool against her skin, the city still hushed in that fragile hour before sunrise. She made coffee and stood by the window, looking out at Lake Union. Mist curled above the water like breath. The streetlights still shimmered faintly on the surface, fading as daylight began to claim the sky. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A message from Evan. Harbor, 7:30. There's something I'd like to show you. She stared at the screen for a long moment. Then, without overthinking, she reached for her coat. The harbor sat at the edge of the city, where the steel and glass of downtown gave way to the soft rhythm of water and gulls. When she arrived, the air carried the scent of salt and pine, the sound of small waves brushing against the dock. Evan was already there, leaning against the wooden railing, hands in his pockets. He turned when he heard her footsteps. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she replied, her breath forming faint clouds in the cool air. For a while, they stood side by side, saying nothing. The sun was rising now, slow, deliberate, painting the water in gold. "This is where my mother used to bring me," he said finally. "Every Sunday morning. She said the world made more sense near the water." Claire smiled softly. She was right. He nodded, his gaze distant. "After she passed, I stopped coming here. I told myself I didn't have time. But the truth was, I didn't want to remember." There was a pause, not awkward, just heavy with memory. He picked up a small pebble and tossed it into the water. "She used to tell me something," he said quietly. "Don't live afraid of breaking, Evan. Live afraid of never feeling." Claire's eyes softened. "She sounds like someone who saw deeply." "She did," he said, "and I think I spent most of my life proving her wrong. I thought fear kept me safe. Turns out, it just kept me small." The wind moved gently through her hair, carrying the faint cry of gulls across the water. She turned to look at him, the man who once hid behind precision and power, now standing open, unguarded, at the edge of the sea. "I've been thinking a lot about fear," she said quietly. "There's fear of losing, and there's fear of living. One keeps you from falling, the other keeps you from flying." He looked at her, then really looked, his eyes searching, thoughtful. "Which one are you?" he asked softly. She hesitated. "I used to be afraid of losing, of jobs, of love, of approval. Now, I think I'm more afraid of not living before it's too late." Evan nodded slowly, as if her words had settled somewhere deep inside him. "I think that's what I've been afraid of too," he said. "Not losing people, losing myself." They stood there for a while, letting the conversation breathe. The sound of the tide filled the spaces between their sentences, soft and steady. Then he said something she didn't expect. "I've started therapy." Her head turned sharply toward him. "Really?" He gave a small, self-conscious laugh. "You sound surprised." "I am," she admitted. "That's brave." He smiled, not proudly, but quietly. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just overdue. I've spent years managing everything except my own heart. I don't want to keep living that way." He paused, then looked out over the water. "I'm changing the culture at Brightline too. No more fear-based management. No more silence mistaken for respect." He glanced at her again. "You started that change. Claire, you showed me what honesty can do when it's spoken with grace." She looked down, her throat tight. "I didn't mean to change anything. I just couldn't stay quiet anymore." "Exactly," he said softly. "That's what real change sounds like." The sun had climbed higher now, warm light spilling across the harbor. Boats rocked gently against their ropes. A pair of seagulls drifted low over the water, their wings glinting white. Evan turned toward her, his expression open, unguarded. "I don't know where this leads," he said quietly, "but I know I want to keep walking toward it, towards something better." For the company, for myself, Claire met his gaze, searching for pretense, for strategy, and found none. What she saw instead was truth, not perfect, not polished, but real, and something inside her softened. She nodded slowly. "Then I hope you do. Evan, for your sake." He smiled faintly. "Maybe for ours." The words lingered between them, gentle, uncertain, but not unwelcome. They turned back toward the water, both quiet now, watching as the light danced across the waves. For Claire, this morning felt like a mirror of all that had been broken and all that had been quietly mended. The fear was still there, yes, but beneath it, something stronger had begun to rise. Not certainty, not control, but faith in the small, imperfect beauty of trying again. A breeze swept through, carrying the scent of salt and cedar. Evan closed his eyes, breathing it in as if relearning the shape of peace. Claire glanced at him, then back toward the horizon where the sunlight touched the water like forgiveness. And for the first time in a long time, she let herself believe that healing wasn't a destination. It was a practice, a quiet morning by the harbor, a conversation between two people learning, at last, not to be afraid of feeling. The morning after the harbor felt lighter, as if the city itself had exhaled. Seattle's skyline shimmered in soft gray light, the air cool and clear, but inside Claire, something deeper was stirring, not peace exactly, but a rare kind of clarity. She dressed carefully that morning, choosing the navy blazer she'd owned for years. It wasn't new, but it was hers, familiar, grounding. As she buttoned it, she caught her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back wasn't the same one who'd once stood trembling in a glass conference room months ago. There was a steadiness now, a quiet resolve that came from surviving herself. By the time she reached Brightline Innovations, the office was already humming with activity. The project team was packing up displays, celebrating success, sharing plans for the weekend. The air buzzed with light conversation, laughter, the kind of sound she hadn't heard here in years. And as she walked through the hallways, several people stopped her small nods, warm smiles, quiet thank yous. They didn't need to say much. She understood. The culture had shifted subtly, powerfully, and somehow she had become part of that change. Still, the decision waited for her like a letter she hadn't opened yet. Evan had given her space, no follow-up messages, no persuasion, just that one offer, vice president of operations, and the silence that followed. It was her choice now. She paused by the large glass window overlooking the city. Below, the streets moved with life. Above, clouds drifted lazily across the pale morning sky. Somewhere between the two was where she stood between endings and beginnings, between safety and growth. Finally, she took a deep breath and walked toward his office. Evan Mercer looked up when she entered. He was standing by the window again, as he so often did, sleeves rolled, expression thoughtful. But when he saw her, his face softened. "Claire," he said quietly. "I wasn't sure if you'd come. I almost didn't," she replied, closing the door behind her. "But here I am." He nodded, gesturing to the seat across from his desk. She didn't sit. Instead, she stood near the window beside him, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. The silence stretched not uncomfortable, just weighted with meaning. "I've thought about your offer," she said finally. He turned toward her, and her voice was calm. "Even if I stay, I can't do it the old way. Not the way things used to be." He didn't interrupt. He knew what was coming and wanted to hear it. "We can't lead with fear," she said. "Not anymore. I've spent too many years watching good people shrink under it, myself included. If I take this position, I need to know we're building something different." Evan's eyes searched hers. Different how with respect, she said. We lead with respect, or not at all. The words came out quietly, but they carried a strength that filled the room. It wasn't a demand, it was a boundary, a truth she had earned the right to speak. Evan didn't respond right away. He turned back toward the window, watching the light shift across the water. Then, finally, he nodded. I agree, he said softly. Completely. She blinked, surprised by how easily he said it. I used to think strength meant control, he continued. Now I see it's about trust, letting people bring their whole selves to the table. You taught me that, Claire, whether you meant to or not. A small smile curved her lips. You make it sound simple. He laughed quietly, a low, genuine sound. It's not, but it's worth trying. They stood there, side by side, the silence between them no longer heavy, but full like the pause between the end of one song and the start of another. After a moment, he turned to her again. So, does that mean you'll stay? Claire looked out at the skyline, the city she'd called home, the life she'd rebuilt piece by piece. Then she looked back at him. Yes, she said softly. I'll stay. But on one condition. He raised an eyebrow. Another one. She smiled faintly. That we hold each other accountable to that promise, respect first. Always. He nodded, extending his hand. Deal. For a heartbeat. Neither of them moved. Then, slowly, she placed her hand in his. It was the first time they had ever touched outside the exchange of documents or folders or handshakes in crowded rooms. His palm was warm, steady hers, trembling just slightly. The moment held quiet, unhurried. No grand confession, no spark of sudden romance, just the honest, human connection of two people who had finally stopped pretending to be unbreakable. When they let go, something lingered, a small, invisible thread that neither could name, but both could feel. Evan exhaled, looking down with a faint smile. You know, I never thought it would be this simple. It's not simple, Claire said gently. It's just right. They both laughed softly, not from humor, but relief. Outside, the clouds parted, letting sunlight pour through the windows. The whole office seemed to brighten. Claire glanced once more at the view, the harbor glittering in the distance, the same place where forgiveness had found its first words. She turned to leave, but paused at the door. Evan? Yes. You were right, she said. Your mother was wise. The world really does make more sense near the water. He smiled, understanding, and near the truth. She nodded once, then walked out her steps, light, steady, free, behind her. Evan stood by the window, watching the sunlight dance across the glass walls. For the first time in years, the reflection looking back at him didn't feel like a stranger. And somewhere deep within both of them, beneath ambition, beneath fear, something new had begun to grow. Not love, not yet. Something quieter. Respect, redemption, renewal. The kind of beginning that only comes after you've learned how to end well. 6 months passed. Seattle's spring sunlight spilled through the wide glass walls of Brightline Innovations, flooding every hallway with warmth. The air inside the building felt different now, lighter, almost alive. Where once there had been tension and hushed footsteps, there was laughter, conversation, and the steady hum of collaboration. It wasn't just the decor that had changed, though the office looked softer now, with plants near the windows and open spaces for quiet thought. It was the people, the rhythm. Something in the company's heartbeat had shifted, and everyone felt it. Evan Mercer, the man once known for his precision and impatience, stood now at the front of the main conference room, speaking to a small group of managers. The morning sun cast golden light across the whiteboard behind him, where the words "listening leadership" were written in blue marker. He leaned against the edge of the table, relaxed, approachable, no more sharp tone, no commanding presence, just a man learning to lead differently. Listening, he said, isn't just hearing words. It's hearing people, their fears, their ideas, even their silence. He paused, letting the words breathe. We can't ask people to give their best if we don't give them our respect first. The room was quiet, but not from fear. It was the quiet of attention, of connection. Claire stood just outside the doorway, listening not as a subordinate anymore, but as an equal, vice president of operations. Even now, the title still felt surreal. But what mattered most wasn't the title. It was the peace she felt when she walked through these halls. From where she stood, she could see the faces of the team young analysts, seasoned designers, new interns just finding their place. They were engaged, smiling, confident. 6 months ago, most of them would have avoided eye contact when Evan spoke. Now, they leaned in. Claire's lips curved into a soft smile. She didn't need to say anything. The transformation spoke for itself. Evan continued, pacing slowly. I used to believe that leadership meant certainty, that being in control was strength. But certainty without compassion is just arrogance in disguise. He looked around the room, his tone both firm and gentle. I learned that the hard way. And I had help learning it. His eyes flickered briefly toward the doorway toward her. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough. Claire felt it, the quiet acknowledgement, the gratitude beneath it. She gave a small nod, then turned away, letting him have his moment. She walked down the hallway, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. The sound felt different now, not like noise, but like rhythm. For years, she'd walked these halls feeling small, unseen. Now, each step carried weight, calm, steady, earned. In the break room, 2 employees were laughing over coffee, one showing the other a photo of her new baby. Someone had left fresh pastries on the counter, no memo, no meeting, just kindness. Claire smiled. These were the little things that told the real story of change. She paused by the large window at the end of the corridor. Outside, the city shimmered, ferries gliding across the bay, sunlight glinting off the water. It was strange, she thought, how growth could be both quiet and vast. Behind her, footsteps approached. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. Eavesdropping again, Evan's voice held a trace of amusement. She turned, smiling, only on the parts worth hearing. He chuckled softly. Fair enough. He joined her by the window, slipping his hands into his pockets. They're good, aren't they? The team? They are, she said, but they're good because they finally feel safe to be. He nodded. That's the goal. Then, after a pause, you know, sometimes I forget how far we've come. 6 months ago, I wasn't sure this place could change. Places don't change, she said gently. People do. And that's what changes everything else. He looked at her for a moment, quiet, thoughtful. You always know how to say what matters. It's the only kind of talking worth doing. They both laughed softly, the kind of laugh that comes easily between people who have weathered storms together and learned how to breathe afterward. The sun shifted slightly, lighting the edges of the window in gold. For a moment, the two of them stood there, the reflection of the city surrounding them, glass, sky, and light blending into something beautiful and whole. There was no tension now, no unfinished sentence between them, just an ease, calm, real, unspoken. He broke the silence first. I was thinking of hosting a company retreat, something outdoors. No laptops, no PowerPoints, just people talking, listening. She smiled. You'd survive that. He grinned, barely, but I'll try. She laughed, a low, warm sound that softened the space between them. As they stood there, side by side, Claire realized something. The story wasn't about redemption anymore, his or hers. It was about evolution, about choosing to live, lead, and connect differently. And though neither said it, both of them knew this was what healing looked like. Not grand, not dramatic, but steady, consistent, alive. After a moment, Evan spoke again, quieter now. You know, sometimes I think about that morning you walked out. Claire turned to him, curious. I used to see it as the moment everything fell apart. He said, now I think, Maybe it was the moment everything finally began. She looked at him for a long moment, then smiled. Funny, I was thinking the same thing. They stood there until the meeting room down the hall erupted in applause, a sound bright and full of life. Evan looked toward the noise, then back at her. "Shall we? Let's," she said, "together." They walked back toward the laughter, toward the living proof of what honesty and courage could build. The glass walls around them shimmered with sunlight. The same walls that had once felt cold now reflected warmth. And as Claire stepped into the light, she felt it fully. Transformation wasn't loud. It was quiet. It was kind. And it was real. Autumn came softly to Seattle, a season of gold leaves and long shadows on glass towers. 6 months had passed since Brightline's quiet rebirth. And the annual company gala had arrived, an evening that once felt like performance now promised something closer to celebration. The ballroom at the downtown Hilton shimmered with light. Crystal chandeliers glowed overhead, their reflections rippling through tall windows that framed the city skyline. Music floated through the air strings, low and elegant, weaving through the gentle hum of conversation. For years, these events had been about prestige-polished speeches, curated smiles, success measured in numbers and applause. But tonight, the atmosphere was different. There was laughter, warmth, ease, the hum of a company that had finally learned how to breathe. Claire stood near the back of the room, watching it all unfold. She wore a simple black gown, her hair swept up, a silver pendant catching the light. Nothing extravagant, but she didn't need extravagance anymore. There was a quiet confidence about her, the kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are. Across the room, Evan Mercer stood at the podium, speaking to an audience of hundreds. But his tone, his presence, it wasn't the same man who once led through control. His voice was calm, genuine, unhurried. "Success," he said, "used to mean perfection to me. It meant control, precision, and results. But I've learned something these past months, something I wish I'd understood years ago." He paused, letting the silence settle. Success without humanity isn't success at all. It's just noise. The audience was still, listening. Even the servers paused for a moment, silver trays suspended mid-air. Evan continued, his eyes sweeping the crowd, but softening as they landed on one familiar face at the back of the room. He didn't look away. "At Brightline," he said, "we've learned that progress isn't built by fear or pressure. It's built by respect, by empathy, by people who dare to tell the truth, even when it's hard to hear." His words hung there, gentle but powerful. Then, with the faintest smile, he added, "There's someone here tonight who reminded me of the truth, who showed me what real strength looks like." The audience turned, following his gaze. Claire felt the weight of their attention, the warmth of recognition, the quiet hum of admiration that moved through the room. Evan continued, his voice steady. "She taught me that leadership isn't about commanding others, it's about earning their trust. She showed me that courage doesn't always sound loud. Sometimes, it sounds like calm." A ripple of applause moved through the crowd. Claire's cheeks flushed, but she didn't look away. She just smiled, small, genuine, touched. He concluded, "So tonight, as we celebrate the company's achievements, I want to celebrate something greater, the people behind them, the hearts that make this place human." The applause this time was thunderous, but through it all, Claire and Evan's eyes remained locked to quiet conversation in the middle of the noise. When he stepped down from the stage, the band began to play again, a soft, slow melody that filled the space with warmth. People returned to their tables, to laughter, to stories and champagne, but Claire stayed still, her heart steady, her thoughts tender. A moment later, Evan appeared beside her, holding 2 glasses of sparkling cider. "For the record," he said lightly, "I didn't plan to embarrass you in front of 200 people." She laughed softly. "You didn't. You honored me. There's a difference." He handed her a glass. "To truth," he said. She clinked it gently against his, and to change. They stood together for a moment, watching the crowd, the team they had built, the life they had helped reshape. There was music, laughter, the sound of something thriving. Then, as the band shifted into a slow, graceful tune, Evan turned toward her. "Would you dance?" Claire hesitated just long enough for a smile to bloom between them. Then she nodded. Yes. He offered his hand, and she took it. The dance floor gleamed under soft light. They moved slowly, naturally, without need for words. Around them, the world blurred into color and motion. The room, the people, the gentle rhythm of strings. It wasn't a dance of romance, not exactly. It was a dance of understanding, of forgiveness, of beginning again. Claire rested her hand lightly against his shoulder, her other hand in his, steady but trembling, just a little. He guided her gently, his movements measured, careful as if this simple act held more meaning than either of them wanted to admit aloud. For a moment, everything else faded, the chatter, the music, even time itself. There was only this, the sound of her quiet breath, the warmth of his hand, the soft rustle of fabric as they moved together through the golden light. When the song ended, they didn't step apart immediately. Their eyes met not with longing, but with gratitude, a silent exchange, a promise without words. We lead with respect, or not at all. The same truth that had rebuilt a company had now rebuilt something else, trust. As applause rose again for the next song, Evan whispered, "Thank you, Claire, for everything." She smiled. "We did this together?" He nodded, "Together." And as they stepped away from the dance floor, the lights above them shimmered like stars reflected in glass, the kind of light that doesn't dazzle but endures. For the first time in years, Brightline wasn't just successful, it was whole. And for Claire and Evan, standing quietly in that glow, success finally meant what it should have all along: to lead, to listen, to live with heart. The night after the gala arrived softly, wrapping the city in a calm that felt almost sacred. The echoes of music, laughter, and applause had faded, leaving only the hush of Seattle at midnight, the hum of distant traffic, the whisper of rain beginning to fall. Claire drove home with the windows slightly cracked, letting the cool air brush against her face. The lights along the waterfront shimmered across the wet streets, blurring into streaks of gold and white. It had been a long evening, not heavy, just full of moments she wanted to hold a little longer before letting them drift into memory. When she reached her small house by the lake, Milo greeted her with his familiar slow wag, old loyal, half asleep but still waiting. She smiled, bending to scratch behind his ear. "Hey, sweetheart, I'm home." The words felt different now. I'm home. Not just back at a place, but back in herself. She changed into her soft robe, put the kettle on, and moved around the kitchen in quiet rhythm, the click of ceramic against counter, the whistle of steam. Outside the window, the lake reflected the city lights, thousands of tiny reflections trembling across the dark water. She carried her cup of tea to the armchair by the window, her favorite place to think. The air smelled faintly of chamomile and rain. She leaned back, exhaling deeply, not from exhaustion, but from a fullness she couldn't quite name. Her eyes wandered to the reflection of the city beyond the glass. It was beautiful, but imperfect, rippling, shifting, alive. And as she watched, a thought rose, unbidden but true. Everything changed when I stopped trying to be perfect and started being true. The words lingered like a whisper from somewhere deep within her, a truth she'd been moving toward for years without realizing it. She thought about all the small choices that had brought her here, the courage to speak when silence had been easier, the strength to walk away when dignity demanded it, the grace to return not out of obligation, but out of purpose. She thought of Evan, of his speech that night, of the way his voice had softened when he spoke of humanity, of her. There had been something honest in his eyes, not the polished confidence of a leader, but the humble steadiness of a man finally learning to live with his own heart. Her phone buzzed softly on the table beside her. A message. She picked it up and smiled. The screen glowed with familiar words. "Good night, Claire. Thank you for changing my world." Her fingers hovered for a moment over the keyboard, but she didn't type. Instead, she set the phone down, looked back toward the water, and whispered softly to herself, to the night, to the universe that had carried them both this far. We changed it together. Outside, the rain had stopped, the clouds above the city began to thin, and the faintest blush of dawn touched the horizon. Claire stood, wrapped her robe tighter, and walked out onto the small deck that overlooked the lake. The boards were cool beneath her feet, the air sharp but sweet. In the distance, the first light of morning shimmered across the surface of the water, soft gold spreading over gray. She stood there for a long time, watching the reflection of the city dissolve into daylight. It felt symbolic somehow, the past fading gently into something new, not erased, but transformed. Behind her, Milo settled near the doorway, sighing contentedly. The kettle clicked off again inside, the world beginning its quiet routine. But Claire stayed where she was still, present, alive. This was the ending she hadn't known she was writing all along. Not a grand victory, not a return to what was, but a homecoming to honesty, to peace, to herself. She closed her eyes and breathed in the scent of the lake, the trees, the faint salt carried by the wind. Somewhere downtown, Brightline's offices would soon light up again, teams arriving, projects beginning, life continuing, and in that glass tower, she imagined Evan standing by the window, coffee in hand, watching the same sunrise. 2 lives, 2 journeys, one quiet truth between them. You don't need to be perfect to make something whole. You just need to be true. The sky brightened, spilling light across the rippling water, and for a moment, everything, the lake, the city, her own reflection seemed to glow from within. Claire smiled. Tomorrow would come with new challenges, new beginnings, new imperfections. But tonight, or rather, this new morning, she felt ready. Ready to live, not just work. Ready to feel, not just function. Ready to begin again. The sun crested the horizon, gold light flooding through the windows and into the small living room. The shadows melted away, and in that light, everything seemed possible. Sometimes, life doesn't fall apart because we fail. It falls apart to remind us of who we are beneath all the noise. Claire's journey shows us that dignity begins the moment we stop living in fear and start living in truth. For years, she stayed silent to survive at work, in love, even within herself. But when she finally chose honesty over perfection, something remarkable happened. She rediscovered her strength. And Evan's transformation reminds us that power without empathy is empty. True leadership in business, in family, in life, begins the day we choose to listen. We all carry armor, built from disappointment, loss, or regret. But healing doesn't come from holding tighter. It comes from letting go, from daring to be seen as imperfect, but real, because at any age, it's never too late to begin again with courage, with compassion, and with truth. Thank you for spending your time with Shining Stories tonight. If Claire's journey touched something in your heart, a memory, a moment, a truth, let us know. Please like this video, share it with someone who needs a little light, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. Because sometimes, one story is all it takes to remind us how beautiful it is to be human.